The lights go out. Not in one city, not in one country, but across entire regions at once. Traffic freezes in the middle of highways. Planes are diverted midair. Banks close their doors. ATMs flash error codes, and cell phones stop connecting to towers. The modern world, so dependent on invisible flows of electricity and data, is suddenly paralyzed. For years, this idea belonged in science fiction or conspiracy theories. But today, Western governments are running simulations of exactly this scenario. They call it preparedness. Critics call it a sign of fear. And former President Donald Trump has called it something else, the opening act of chaos. At the heart of this story lies a chilling truth. Digital war doesn't look like the wars of the past. There are no tanks rolling over borders, no bombs lighting up the sky. Instead, it creeps in silently, through lines of code, through fiber optic cables, through servers hidden in windowless buildings. The weapon isn't gunpowder or steel. It's malware, ransomware, disinformation, and sabotage. And in a world that has wired itself so tightly together, the consequences of even a small strike can ripple faster than any missile. NATO officials, Pentagon strategists, and intelligence agencies across Europe and North America know this. That's why, in recent years, you've started to hear about resilience drills and blackout exercises. Governments simulate what happens if power grids fail, if internet providers collapse, if satellites are blinded. These simulations are often cloaked in vague language. Officials say they're about stress testing critical infrastructure. But the timing, the secrecy, and the participation of militaries raise a darker question. Are these nations quietly preparing for the unthinkable? For Donald Trump, the answer was clear. During his presidency, he repeatedly warned that America was unprepared for what he called the war of the invisible battlefield. He claimed that a cyber blackout would hit harder than any conventional strike, because Americans wouldn't just face destruction, they'd face paralysis. In speeches, he painted scenarios that sounded alarmist at the time. Gas stations running dry, grocery stores stripped bare, hospitals turning away patients. Many in Washington dismissed his warnings as exaggeration. Yet today, when you look at the scale of simulations being run, it's hard to ignore how close his warnings were to reality. Imagine this: a single cyber attack targeting power substations on the East Coast. Within minutes, New York and Washington, D.C. go dark. Subways stop, skyscrapers evacuate, trading floors close. Now stretch that out for days. Refrigerators spoil, gas pumps don't work, and millions of people start panicking. This isn't hypothetical. Experts point to Ukraine in 2015, when hackers believed to be linked to Russia shut down the power grid during winter, leaving hundreds of thousands without heat or light. If that could happen in Ukraine, could it happen in Paris, London, or Chicago? That's the nightmare scenario fueling these exercises. And it's not just about electricity. Think about water systems. In 2021, hackers gained access to a water treatment facility in Florida and tried to poison the supply by changing chemical levels. They were caught just in time. But what if they hadn't been? Or consider food supply chains. Trucks rely on GPS and digital logistics to deliver everything from bread to baby formula. A disruption in networks doesn't just freeze communication. It starves a country from the inside out. This is why Western governments stage what some call digital war games. They shut down simulated networks, force officials to respond to phantom crises, and study how fast societies crumble when the lights go off. But these exercises reveal something uncomfortable. In a cyber blackout, there's no front line. Everyone is a target. Banks, schools, airports, even families in their homes, all depend on the same fragile grid. That means the battlefield is everywhere, and the soldiers are not just generals, but ordinary citizens trying to survive. Trump's framing of this danger was blunt. He warned that hesitation would be fatal. In his view, America needed to harden its systems, not just with firewalls, but with physical defenses, backup power, stockpiles of essentials, communication lines that could survive without the internet. He compared it to nuclear deterrence. Just as the Cold War relied on showing strength to prevent attack, Trump argued that cyber resilience had to be visible. Otherwise, enemies would gamble on America's weakness. And those enemies, in his mind, were already testing the waters. Russia has been accused repeatedly of probing Western grids, leaving behind malware designed to be triggered later. China, meanwhile, is accused of quietly embedding itself in telecom networks, raising fears that it could flip a switch if tensions rise. Even North Korea, with its limited resources, has unleashed cyber attacks that stole millions from banks and froze companies with ransomware. The battlefield is global, and it's already active. But here's where the story gets even more complicated. Simulations don't just prepare for attacks. They also normalize the idea that an attack is inevitable. When NATO runs an exercise in the Baltics, when Britain tests how its hospitals would respond to a nationwide blackout, when American agencies rehearse restoring internet under fire, they're all sending a message. This is coming. The question isn't if, it's when. And that message alone may be reshaping global strategy. Inside the Pentagon, cyber defense is now treated on par with nuclear defense. Documents describe a digital deterrence posture that suggests America could respond to a cyber attack with military force, even conventional strikes. That blurs the line between digital war and physical war. If Russia shuts down the grid in Boston, does the US launch missiles in return? If Chinese hackers sabotage European trade networks, does NATO activate Article 5, the Mutual Defense Clause? These are the questions haunting policymakers. And in that gray zone, Trump's chaos warning takes on weight. He argued that America's enemies wouldn't just use cyber blackouts to destroy, they'd use them to destabilize. Imagine an election day blackout in swing states. Imagine Wall Street frozen during a crisis. Imagine hospitals going dark during a pandemic. Each scenario isn't about conquering land. It's about sowing panic, dividing allies, and forcing leaders into desperate decisions. In his words, chaos is the weapon. So when you see governments staging these quiet exercises, you're looking at more than preparedness. You're looking at fear. Fear that the next war will not be fought on battlefields or even in the skies, but in the silence after the lights go out. Fear that power itself, not just political power, but literal electricity, can be stolen in an instant. And fear that once that theft begins, the social fabric will unravel faster than leaders can respond. This is the paradox of the cyber blackout simulation. To prepare for it, governments must imagine it. To imagine it, they must accept its plausibility. And once you accept that plausibility, you begin to see the world differently. Suddenly, every line of code is a potential weapon. Every power station is a target. Every bank, hospital, or satellite becomes part of the battlefield. Trump's voice, loud and often controversial, cut through this unease with blunt clarity. Hesitation equals defeat. He didn't dress it up in polite diplomatic phrases. He warned openly that America could collapse from within if it didn't take the digital war as seriously as nuclear war. Whether you agreed with him or not, his words tapped into a reality that experts whisper about, but rarely say aloud. The next world war may not begin with explosions. It may begin with silence. When the Cold War ended, many believed the greatest threat to the West had passed. Nuclear arsenals still existed, but the world seemed to enter a new era of globalization, where markets and technology mattered more than tanks. But hidden in that optimism was a vulnerability no one fully grasped: dependence. Every city, every industry, every home became tied to an invisible web of digital systems. Power grids synchronized across borders. Financial networks spanned continents. Communication relied on satellites orbiting thousands of miles above the Earth. At first, this connectivity looked like progress, but now it looks like exposure. Because when everything is connected, everything can be broken. Western governments have started to admit this, though rarely in public speeches. Instead, the truth slips out in classified briefings, in leaked documents, or in subtle shifts of policy. Take the European Union's Cyber Solidarity Act, a framework for joint response to massive cyber attacks. It doesn't spell out a blackout, but when you read between the lines, the fear is obvious. An attack on one country's grid or communications system could cascade into others. A strike on Paris could ripple into Berlin, into Rome, into Brussels, faster than leaders can coordinate a response. That's why the EU has invested in rapid cyber defense teams, units that can be deployed almost like soldiers. Their mission isn't to shoot bullets, but to patch networks before panic spreads. Across the Atlantic, the United States has gone even further. Agencies like the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, have been quietly running large-scale simulations with private companies. Power utilities, telecom providers, even grocery chains are asked to participate. The scenario: a massive, sustained cyber attack on the U.S. critical infrastructure. How do you deliver food when GPS is down? How do hospitals run when their digital records are frozen? How do firefighters respond when 911 is offline? The results are rarely shared, but occasional leaks paint a sobering picture. The country is fast, innovative, and resilient in patches. But at a national level, the systems are too complex, too fragile, and too dependent on digital lifelines to withstand a long blackout. This is the core of Trump's argument. He said it wasn't enough to have the strongest military if the lights could be switched off with a keystroke. He mocked the Pentagon's trillion-dollar fighter jets, saying they'd be useless if air traffic control collapsed in a blackout. He warned that America's enemies wouldn't need bombs or tanks. They would need hackers, patience, and a willingness to watch the West crumble from within. His critics dismissed him as alarmist, but the drills that governments now conduct, sometimes even with NATO allies, suggest that his warnings hit a nerve. Think back to 2017. A malware attack known as NotPetya tore through global systems. It wasn't aimed at the United States or Europe specifically, but within hours, it had crippled companies from shipping giant Maersk to pharmaceutical firm Merck. Ports closed. Deliveries stopped. Losses were estimated in the billions. And that was just one piece of code, unleashed without a full-scale war. Imagine that multiplied, not one virus, but dozens, targeting banks, hospitals, utilities, government agencies, all at once. That's the nightmare scenario these simulations try to prepare for. The problem, though, is that simulations have limits. They can't replicate panic. They can't replicate the way people behave when ATMs stop working, when shelves go empty, when gas stations are out of fuel. Social scientists warn that society is only 9 meals away from collapse. In other words, 3 days without food delivery, and order starts to break down. Police face riots. Governments face mass protests. Communities fracture. And in a cyber blackout, that clock starts ticking almost immediately. For NATO, the blackout scenario has an added dimension: war. Military planners know the cyber attack on civilian infrastructure could be the first step in a larger conflict. If power grids go down in Norway, if communication networks collapse in Poland, it might not just be hackers at work. It could be the opening strike of a Russian offensive. That's why NATO war games increasingly include cyber simulations alongside tanks and jets. Soldiers are trained to fight not just in the field, but in the dark, without GPS, without reliable comms, without the internet that coordinates every move of modern warfare. Putin understands this dynamic. Russian doctrine explicitly treats cyber attacks as tools of war. They're not sideshows. They're front lines. In 2007, Estonia, a NATO member, suffered a wave of cyber attacks that crippled banks, media, and government sites. It was one of the first examples of a digital assault on a nation. Since then, Moscow has only refined its methods. From Ukraine's grid to Western elections, Russian fingerprints have been found on countless cyber incidents. Each time, deniability is baked in. Officials shrug and say it's just patriotic hackers. But the message is clear. Russia knows how fragile the digital West really is. Trump's approach to this was confrontational. He argued that America had to fight fire with fire. If Russia or China was preparing to unleash digital chaos, then the U.S. should show that it could do the same, or worse. His administration pushed for more offensive cyber capabilities, essentially turning America's hackers into soldiers. The logic was deterrence. If your enemy knows you can shut down their lights too, they might hesitate before striking. But this logic has a flaw. In the physical world, you can see missiles. You can count tanks. In cyberspace, there's no such visibility. Deterrence becomes guesswork, and guesswork in a crisis can spiral fast. The other flaw is that cyber weapons are leaky. Unlike missiles, a line of malicious code can spread beyond its target. NotPetya was meant to punish Ukraine, but it spread across the globe. Stuxnet, the virus that sabotaged Iran's nuclear program, was eventually discovered and copied. In other words, once a cyber weapon is unleashed, it doesn't just hit your enemy. It can circle back, hitting allies, businesses, even your own infrastructure. That's why some experts argue that cyber war is more like playing with fire than playing chess. Once it starts, no one truly controls it. Western governments know this, yet they continue to run their simulations. They build backup communication lines using radio. They encourage companies to stockpile analog tools. They invest in satellite networks designed to survive attacks. But beneath the surface, a sense of dread remains. Because unlike nuclear war, which has a clear threshold, launch or don't launch, cyber war exists in the shadows. Attacks happen all the time, just below the level of war. Systems are probed, networks are breached, data is stolen. Each intrusion tests the limits of patience, the willingness of leaders to call it an act of war. And that gray zone is where chaos thrives. This is why Trump's warnings about chaos resonate. He wasn't predicting a conventional blackout, like a storm knocking out power lines. He was predicting a hybrid strike, digital sabotage designed to trigger social collapse. A strike where no one knows who is responsible, where allies argue over proof, where panic spreads faster than truth. In that fog, governments can't act decisively. And in that fog, enemies gain leverage. The irony is that the very act of preparing for a blackout may create new risks. If citizens know their governments are simulating nationwide outages, some may lose faith in the resilience of their systems. Conspiracy theories flourish. Markets twitch. Adversaries take note. A rehearsal for resilience can look, from the outside, like a rehearsal for disaster. And if Trump is right, hesitation, even hesitation caused by fear of panic, could be deadly. So we are left with a paradox. The West is preparing for a blackout it insists will never come. It is training for chaos while hoping to prevent it. It is building digital shields while quietly sharpening digital swords. And in the middle of this paradox sits a terrifying possibility that the first true cyber blackout will not look like a drill, but the drill will look eerily like the blackout. That's the danger of simulations. They blur the line between preparation and prophecy. The final piece of the puzzle isn't hardware or software. It's psychology. Because in a blackout, the first thing to fail isn't always the grid, it's trust. Imagine sitting in your apartment and the lights go out. Minutes turn to hours. You reach for your phone, but the signal is gone. The news doesn't load. ATMs are dark. Gas pumps are locked. The silence grows heavier. You don't know if it's a storm, an accident, or something bigger. That uncertainty spreads faster than the outage itself. People hoard food. Lines form outside gas stations. Rumors swirl. And within days, the greatest challenge isn't technical repair. It's social survival. Western governments know this, which is why their simulations increasingly focus on information as much as electricity. Can you keep people calm when the internet is down? Can you stop panic when rumors spread by word of mouth instead of Twitter? The terrifying answer is maybe not. Studies from smaller blackouts show how quickly fear takes hold. In the cyber blackout scenario, fear is magnified because people won't just think the system failed. They'll think it was attacked. And in that suspicion lies the risk of escalation. Trump often hammered this point. He argued that enemies don't even need to win a war. They just need to convince the West it has lost control. A 3-day blackout in a major city could do that. Stock markets could plunge. Political leaders could face riots. Alliances could fracture. Trump said it plainly. Chaos is the weapon, and hesitation is the fuse. His critics dismissed the line as a soundbite, but it captured a reality intelligence officials whisper about. In the next war, victory may not be measured in battles won, but in societies destabilized. Putin, of course, sees the same dynamic. Russia's doctrine leans heavily on what it calls information confrontation. It's not just about hacking machines, but hacking perception. If NATO countries start doubting each other, if citizens start doubting their leaders, the alliance weakens without a shot fired. A blackout becomes not just a technical crisis, but a political weapon. And that's what makes the West's preparation both necessary and dangerous. The more openly leaders talk about cyber risks, the more adversaries see fear they can exploit. So where does this leave us? In a paradox. On one hand, the West is quietly preparing for the unthinkable, running simulations, building cyber armies, hardening infrastructure. On the other hand, the very act of preparing acknowledges how vulnerable the system really is. It's like practicing for a fire drill in a house built of dry wood. The drill helps, but it doesn't change the material. As the world drifts deeper into this digital frontier, one truth becomes unavoidable. The first great war of the 21st century may not begin with explosions in the sky. It may begin with silence, with screens going dark, with voices cut off, with cities plunged into confusion. It may begin with a blackout that feels like an accident until it doesn't. And when that day comes, the question won't be who has more tanks or missiles. It will be who can keep their people calm, who can restore order faster, who can fight through the fog of chaos without hesitating. Because in a cyber war, hesitation is defeat. Trump's words, mocked by some, feared by others, echo louder in that context. Hesitation kills. It's not just a political slogan. It's a survival principle. For the West, the challenge isn't just to build stronger firewalls. It's to build stronger resilience in governments and markets and people. Because the blackout, if it comes, won't just test the wires and grids. It will test the very fabric of society. And so we end where we began, with a question. Is the West quietly preparing for digital war? Yes, but is it enough? That answer remains uncertain, because preparation can only go so far when the battlefield is everywhere, when the first strike is invisible, and when the greatest weapon of all is chaos itself.